It began in silence, a silence so deep it seems to swallow the world whole. The air is heavy and unmoving, a frozen breath suspended over the Volga River. It is winter in southern Russia, 1942, though calling it winter hardly captures it. This is something else, something older, harsher. The kind of cold that turns metal brittle and breath to crystals that hang in the air before vanishing into nothing. The city before you is not quite a city anymore. What remains of Stalingrad clings to the banks of the Volga like a broken monument, its buildings shattered, its streets reduced to powder and ash. The snow here is grey. It no longer falls softly, but drifts like the settling of dust after a long, violent dream. Once, this was a living place. Children walked to school beneath the shadow of factory chimneys. Men and women filled the tramways, the bakeries, the crowded markets that wound through the narrow lanes. Ships carried grain and steel down the river. It was not beautiful, but it was alive. A working city for working people. Now, all that remains are outlines. Empty windows stare like hollow eyes. Collapsed roofs expose the skeletons of factories. The wind slips through concrete cracks, carrying with it the faint, untraceable sound of what used to be. Laughter, footsteps, the clatter of trams. On the horizon, the sky glows faintly red. The fires have burned for months, feeding on everything that once stood here. Steel beams still twist and groan as they cool in the night air. From afar, the city looks like it's breathing, expanding and contracting with every gust of frozen wind. And yet, somewhere in all this ruin, there is movement, a flicker of life beneath the snow. In the half-light of dawn, small figures shuffle through the rubble, soldiers wrapped in rags, their faces hidden behind scarves stiff with frost. Some are German, some are Soviet. All are barely human now, reduced to silhouettes moving between the remnants of walls, seeking warmth where there is none. The front line has dissolved. There are no clear boundaries anymore, only the shifting lines of survival. It is hard to believe that not so long ago, this same place was filled with thunder, artillery, aircraft, the constant grind of tanks clawing through the mud. The noise was so total that silence seemed impossible. And yet here it is now, vast, suffocating, absolute. If you listen closely, you might still hear the echoes, a distant rumble, like a memory refusing to fade. The footsteps of an army that came here believing it would conquer a city and found instead the limits of human endurance. They came for glory, for empire, for ideology, and they stayed for months, trapped in ice and hunger. Stalingrad became less a battle than a question. How far could men go before they ceased to be men at all? The snow does not answer. It covers all things equally, friend and foe, ruin and triumph. As dawn breaks, the first light of day glances off the Volga's surface. It is the same river it has always been, ancient, indifferent. It carries fragments of ice past the sleeping city, as if time itself has decided to keep moving, even when everything else has stopped. In the stillness, you can almost imagine peace. But beneath the snow lies the truth. Millions of footprints frozen in place, each one belonging to someone who thought they would return home. This is where the tide of the Second World War turned, not in the halls of power or the minds of generals, but here, in this frozen labyrinth of shattered stone and steel. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the breaking point of certainty, the moment when the unstoppable met the unyielding. And as the light grows stronger, illuminating the endless ruins, one thought remains. Nothing here was ever truly won, only endured. Before the smoke and snow, before the city became a graveyard, there was a road, long, dusty, and crowded with dreams of conquest. It began not in Stalingrad, but hundreds of miles to the west, in the ambitions of a man who believed the world could be bent to his will. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler had already conquered most of Europe. France had fallen, Norway was occupied, and the British Isles stood alone, defiant but cornered. To the east stretched a land vast beyond comprehension, the Soviet Union, a continent within a continent, home to fields, forests, and cities that had never seen a German uniform. To Hitler, it was a blank space waiting to be rewritten. He called it Lebensraum, living space, a cruel euphemism for conquest. He imagined German farms on Russian soil, German industry fueled by Soviet oil, and a new empire stretching to the Urals. So, in June 1941, without warning, the German army turned east. 3 million soldiers, supported by tanks, aircraft, and an entire machinery of war, surged across the border. They called it Operation Barbarossa. At first, it seemed unstoppable. Columns of panzers rolled across the plains. Soviet divisions crumbled under the shock. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. German officers spoke confidently of reaching Moscow by Christmas. But Russia is not kind to those who underestimate it. The roads turned to mud in the autumn rains. The air froze in winter. Engines stalled. Men froze, and the supply lines stretched thin across the endless steppe. The Wehrmacht had planned for victory in months. It found itself in a land that could not be conquered so quickly. Still, the advance continued. By the spring of 1942, Hitler sought a new target. Something symbolic. Something that would restore the aura of inevitability. Moscow had eluded him. So his gaze turned south, to the vast open plains of the Caucasus, rich in oil, and to one city that bore the name of his enemy, Stalingrad. It was not the city's industry that mattered most, though it was significant. It was its name. To capture Stalingrad would be to humiliate Joseph Stalin himself, to plant the swastika on a city that embodied Soviet pride. It was to be a psychological blow as much as a military one. In July 1942, the German Sixth Army began its advance toward the Volga. They were confident, elite, well-equipped, and accustomed to victory. The Soviets, meanwhile, were exhausted. The previous year's losses were almost beyond comprehension. Entire armies had vanished. Millions of soldiers were lost. Yet despite everything, the Red Army was learning, slowly, painfully, but with growing resolve. Joseph Stalin ordered his generals to defend Stalingrad at all costs. By August, German aircraft were already circling over the city. The first bombs fell like punctuation marks on a story that was already written in fire. Within days, entire districts were flattened. Tens of thousands of civilians perished. The Volga ran red with clay, ash, and blood. Still, the Soviet leadership refused evacuation. Factories continued to produce tanks within the city limits, even as bombs fell around them. Workers built weapons by day and fought as soldiers by night. For those on the ground, it was not strategy, it was survival. And for those advancing, it was not triumph, it was descent. The Germans believed they were chasing a retreating enemy. What they found instead was a wall of resistance, a city that would not fall quietly. As the summer air turned to autumn haze, the two armies met at the edge of Stalingrad, a meeting not of men, but of worlds. One side sought to dominate, the other refused to disappear. And as the sun set over the Volga that evening, it was clear. This would not be another swift campaign. This would be a place where time itself would slow, where every street, every building, every single room would have to be fought for. The road to Stalingrad had ended. But the battle, the real battle, was only just beginning. Before the bombs and the hunger, before the frost turned men into statues, Stalingrad was a city of rhythm and labor. It sat stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, long and thin like a ribbon of stone and smoke. A city born not from beauty, but from purpose. It was here that the Soviet Union built some of its most important factories, the kind that forged tractors in peace and tanks in war. The skyline was dominated by chimneys and cranes, not domes or spires. Every morning, sirens marked the start of shifts, and every evening, they signaled the end. It was not a romantic place, but it pulsed with life. The life of workers, engineers, and families bound together by the hum of industry. When the war reached Stalingrad's doorstep in the summer of 1942, it was home to nearly 500,000 people. Many had fled from western cities already consumed by the German advance, hoping the Volga would protect them. The river was wide and slow, and the steppes seemed endless beyond it, a natural barrier, people thought, between them and the storm. But the storm was already coming. Stalingrad was more than a name on a map. To the Soviet Union, it was a symbol of industrial power and socialist pride. Founded as Tsaritsyn in the 16th century, it had grown from a small trading post into a major industrial hub. When it was renamed after Joseph Stalin in 1925, it became a monument to the new order, a city that embodied the revolution's promise of progress and production. Everywhere you looked, there were signs of that transformation. Vast complexes like the Red October Steelworks, the Barricadi Ordnance Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant. Each of these would soon become fortresses in their own right. Before the war, the factories had been busy with the rhythm of modern life. Tractors rolling off assembly lines, whistles echoing across the Volga, barges carrying cargo to and from the docks. The air was filled with soot and ambition. By 1942, that motion had turned to mobilization. The same assembly lines that once produced farming machinery now turned out T-34 tanks. The same workers who once built engines now learned to fire rifles. Entire families lived beside their workplaces, sleeping in cellars beneath the thunder of forges. They could not have known how vital their endurance would become. In the high summer heat of August 1942, the German Sixth Army began its approach. From the air, the city looked deceptively ordinary. Long roads, clustered buildings, and the gleaming curve of the Volga. But on the ground, German soldiers saw something else, a challenge. The city stretched for nearly 30 miles along the river, but it was only a few miles wide. It was a labyrinth of brick, rail lines, and factories, difficult to navigate, impossible to surround quickly. And beyond the river lay the Soviet rear, where ferries continued to carry supplies and reinforcements. Still, confidence was high. The Germans believed that the Red Army, battered and retreating, could not hold much longer. They expected the city to fall within days. The Luftwaffe began the prelude to occupation with one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. On August 23rd, the sky turned black with planes. More than 1,000 sorties were flown that day. The bombs fell in waves, turning streets into infernos. Oil tanks near the river burst into flame, sending pillars of smoke thousands of feet into the air. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated in minutes. The sound was continuous, a rolling thunder that never seemed to end. People ran to the river for safety, only to find the banks burning, the water thick with debris. Wooden houses vanished in firestorms. The air became unbreathable. Tens of thousands of civilians perished that day alone. Those who survived dug into basements, cellars, and the ruins of the factories themselves. The Volga glowed red at night, lit by the fires that refused to die. The Germans watched from a distance, convinced the city had been destroyed. But beneath the rubble, life remained. In the days that followed, Soviet soldiers began to arrive in small groups, crossing the Volga under constant bombardment. They came at night, ferries, barges, even small fishing boats, guided by the faint outline of the burning city. Many never made it across. Those who did arrived soaked, freezing, and immediately thrown into battle. They joined the remnants of local militia, factory workers, and police already fighting among the ruins. Commanders had little time to organize. Units formed around whoever was still standing. The city's destruction had created a strange advantage. The very ruins that made Stalingrad unlivable also made it nearly impossible to conquer. Streets were blocked by debris, sniper positions were everywhere, and visibility was almost non-existent. German tanks found themselves trapped in narrow alleys. Infantry advanced building by building, sometimes room by room. The Luftwaffe continued to bomb, but each explosion only created more cover. For the civilians still trapped inside, survival became a kind of resistance. They cooked in secret, drank melted snow, and whispered to each other in the dark. When Soviet soldiers appeared, they shared what little they had: a crust of bread, a few drops of water. Children carried ammunition in buckets. Old men helped dig trenches with frozen hands. There was no longer any clear line between soldier and citizen. Everyone belonged to the city now. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin issued his infamous Order No. 227. Not one step back. Retreat was forbidden. It was a brutal command, born of desperation, but it also served its purpose. The Red Army began to fight with a grim, unbreakable resolve. For them, Stalingrad was not just a city, it was the line between existence and annihilation. When Stalin declared that there is no land beyond the Volga, it was more than propaganda. For many of the soldiers there, it was literal truth. Behind them was only the river. There was nowhere else to go, so they stayed. By early September, German troops entered the northern districts. The fighting that followed was unlike anything seen before. In open terrain, armies fought with tanks and artillery. In Stalingrad, they fought over staircases, basements, and courtyards. Each factory became a fortress. The Red October plant, the Barricadi factory, the grain elevator, all turned into self-contained worlds of battle. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because that's what it felt like. Men moving through ruins, fighting in the dark, struggling for inches of ground. The Germans took one street, only to lose it by nightfall. The Soviets counterattacked with bayonets and grenades. Neither side could rest. The Volga froze at night, and the wounded lay in the open, frost forming on their uniforms. In this chaos, time lost meaning. Days and nights blended into one long grey fog of exhaustion. Commanders on both sides began to speak of house battles, measuring progress not in miles but in walls taken and stairwells held. A single apartment block could change hands 5 or 6 times in a week. And yet, amid the destruction, small moments of humanity persisted. A soldier would share a cigarette with his comrade before climbing a ruined stairway. A nurse would hum softly to the wounded in a basement lit only by candlelight. Somewhere a piano stood upright among the ruins, its strings frozen, its sound long gone. But the shape of it reminded those who passed that once there had been music here. Letters were still written, though few were delivered. Some soldiers wrote their names on walls, as if to leave proof they had existed. Others carried small icons or photographs, smudged and worn from being touched too often. There was no room for triumph here, only endurance. By mid-September, both sides had lost tens of thousands of men. The Germans had reached the river in some sectors, but failed to drive the Soviets entirely from the city. The fighting only grew denser, more desperate, as reinforcements arrived on both sides. The Volga, once a lifeline of trade, had become a river of fire. Barges carrying ammunition were bombed in mid-crossing, setting the water ablaze. Yet still, night after night, boats came. The Red Army refused to yield. By the end of September, the Stalingrad that once was had ceased to exist. What remained was a landscape of ruins, a labyrinth of collapsed walls and blackened chimneys, half buried under snow and ash. The factories continued to operate sporadically, even under bombardment, producing weapons that were carried directly to the front lines a few streets away. To outsiders, the city looked dead. To those within it, it was more alive than ever. Every breath, every heartbeat, a small act of defiance. In the dark cellars, people whispered of endurance, not triumph, perhaps not even survival, but simply the will to continue. The city would not yield. And as autumn deepened and the nights grew colder, something began to shift. A quiet, invisible turn in the rhythm of the war. The Germans still advanced, but slower now, more cautiously. They were bleeding in the ruins. What had begun as a swift campaign was turning into a siege. The city on the Volga, the fragile giant of steel and smoke, was refusing to die. And in that refusal lay the first hint of a reversal that would change the course of the entire war. By late November 1942, Stalingrad had ceased to resemble anything human. From the air, it was a scar, a grey expanse where the lines between earth, rubble, and river blurred into one indistinguishable ruin. Smoke still hung over the city like a lid. Fires burned beneath the snow. Whole districts no longer had names, only coordinates. To the west of the Volga, the German Sixth Army crouched in the debris it had created. To the east, across the frozen water, the Soviet 62nd Army clung to what remained of the city, its positions scattered, fragmented, yet alive. This was no longer a conventional battle. It was a siege in all but name. The front had dissolved into chaos. Each side occupied pockets of resistance, sometimes separated by no more than a street, sometimes by nothing more than a wall. Maps were meaningless. Orders often failed to reach their intended units, and yet both sides continued to fight, not for strategy or maneuver, but simply to exist for one more hour. The word siege conjures images of encircled castles and starving garrisons. But Stalingrad was something far worse. A siege without walls, without distinction between inside and outside. There was no safety, no rear lines. Every position could be reached by artillery. Every shelter could be bombed. Every river crossing could be shelled. To the Germans, it was a city they believed they had nearly taken. To the Soviets, it was a city they believed they could never lose. And between those two convictions lay 500,000 men, trapped in a world where night and day no longer mattered. By December, winter had come in full force. The Volga froze solid in places, the wind whipping across it like a blade. Soldiers on both sides spoke of the sound the frost made, a faint, cracking whisper that carried across the river at night, as if the city itself were breathing through the ice. The snow was deceptive. It softened the shapes of the ruins, covered the scars, made everything appear momentarily peaceful. But beneath that white film lay the truth of war, the cost measured in lives, not victories. In basements and dugouts, survivors huddled around stoves made from shell casings. The walls were blackened from smoke, the air thick with the smell of fuel and damp clothing. At night, artillery lit the sky in pulses of orange and red. It was said that in Stalingrad there was no such thing as true darkness, only the intervals between explosions. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it came in fragments. Soldiers learned to rest with one ear open, their weapons close, their nerves strung tight as wire. As the siege deepened, the city became a battleground of individuals. Large-scale operations gave way to personal duels, one man against another, hidden somewhere in the endless ruins. Snipers ruled the daylight. They occupied the upper floors of shattered buildings, their rifles wrapped in cloth to muffle sound and glint. The most famous among them was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals turned sharpshooter. In the first weeks of his deployment, he became a symbol of Soviet resistance. But for every celebrated sniper, there were hundreds more whose names were never recorded. Young men who spent days without movement, their fingers numb, their breath forming faint clouds in the frozen air. They waited for a flicker of movement, a glint of metal, a sign of life in the enemy's ruin. The Germans responded with their own marksmen, their own hunters. In some buildings, rival snipers watched each other for hours, separated by only a few walls of brick. A single wrong move, a reflection in a shard of glass, and the silence would end in a single echoing shot. It was war reduced to its smallest, most intimate scale, one heartbeat against another. Though most of Stalingrad's civilians had fled before the bombardment, thousands remained, too old, too ill, or simply unable to leave. They lived in the cellars of collapsed houses, digging into the frozen ground for warmth. Women worked as nurses or cooks for the Red Army, often within sight of the front line. Children carried ammunition or messages through the ruins, moving silently, unseen. But even in the darkness, life persisted. A candle burning beside a sleeping form, a pot of thin soup boiling over a fire made from broken floorboards. When Soviet soldiers found these civilians, they often stayed with them for a time, sharing rations, mending walls, exchanging stories. It gave the illusion, however brief, that the world outside the war still existed. And perhaps that illusion was enough to keep them alive. For General Paulus and his staff, the situation was becoming untenable. They had taken most of the city, but they could not finish the job. Each day, reports came in of Soviet counterattacks. Each night, new troops crossed the Volga. The river, though frozen in parts, still moved, carrying life from one side to the other. The Sixth Army was under constant pressure. Its flanks, held by Romanian and Italian divisions, were stretched too thin. Morale was sinking. Supplies were dwindling. Yet, in Berlin, Hitler's messages remained triumphant. He spoke of imminent victory, of banners soon to be raised over the Volga. To retreat was forbidden. To pause was unthinkable. So the Germans dug in, unaware that the trap was already being built around them. Behind the lines, in the frozen forests north and south of Stalingrad, entire Soviet armies. Across the river, life and death followed the same rhythm. Night after night, boats crossed under the cover of darkness. The water was thick with ice, the air sharp and blinding, but still they came. Men, ammunition, bread, fuel. The crossing was chaos. Artillery thundered from the west bank, machine guns swept the water, and the ferrymen navigated by instinct, guided only by the faint lights on the far shore. Many boats never arrived. Some sank silently into the black water, leaving only ripples. Others burned mid-crossing, the flames reflected in the ice like strange lanterns. But enough made it through, enough to keep the defense alive. On the east bank, hospitals were dug into the cliffs, long, narrow tunnels lined with wounded men. Doctors worked in dim light, the sound of bombardment echoing overhead. They worked until they collapsed, then were replaced by others. In those tunnels, the smell of blood and smoke, mixed with the faint sweetness of river water, soldiers spoke softly to each other, voices hushed not by fear, but by fatigue. They did not speak of victory, only of holding on. By January 1943, time had lost meaning. The days blurred together, each one the same grey colour as the sky. No one knew the exact date anymore. Only the rhythm of artillery marked the passage of time. The Germans, once so confident, now moved cautiously. They had learned to fear the silence between shell bursts, the quiet that meant another Soviet counterattack was coming. Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, had become part of the city itself. They knew every corridor, every trench, every hidden approach. The ruins that had once been their prison were now their armour. In some places, the two armies were separated by only a few feet of rubble. They could hear each other breathe. They could smell the smoke from each other's fires. And yet, they kept fighting, as if compelled by something larger than reason. The siege was no longer about territory or even survival. It had become ritual, the daily act of defiance in a place where defiance was the only thing left. Unknown to the men trapped inside the city, the world beyond Stalingrad had already changed. In November, two massive Soviet offensives, Operation Uranus in the north and south, had begun. The German flanks crumbled under the assault. Within days, the Soviet pincers met west of Stalingrad, encircling the entire Sixth Army. But inside the city, the soldiers did not yet understand what had happened. All they knew was that the bombardment from the east had intensified, that their supply lines had gone quiet, that the sky now carried a different sound, the steady drone of Soviet aircraft where once the Luftwaffe had ruled. Slowly, realization spread. They were surrounded. The siege had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. For now, the Sixth Army still held the ruins, unaware that the world outside had already sealed its fate. Inside the broken city, the fires still burned, The snow still fell, and men still clung to life in cellars that smelled of smoke and iron. They did not yet know that escape was no longer possible, that the siege had already become a grave. Winter came to Stalingrad not as a season, but as a sentence. The cold descended with a stillness that seemed to silence even the guns. The smoke from the ruins froze in the air, hanging motionless above streets already buried beneath months of ash. The Volga, wide and slow, turned solid, its surface split by jagged ridges of ice. The city was now a world of grey and white, a landscape drained of all colour and warmth. Every wall was rimed with frost. Every breath turned to crystal and vanished. Even sound seemed to move differently, dulled and distant, as though trapped inside the cold itself. And within this frozen wasteland, two armies continued to exist. Not fight, not move, but exist. They no longer dreamed of victory or escape. Their lives had narrowed to the space, between one heartbeat and the next, one scrap of food and the next. This was the winter of 1942-43, the heart of the siege, and it would become one of the coldest winters ever recorded in the history of war. In November, the trap had closed. The Soviet Operation Uranus had swept around the flanks of Stalingrad, cutting off the German Sixth Army and sealing it inside the city it had nearly conquered. At first, the encirclement was hard to believe. The Germans had grown used to being the ones who dictated the pace of war. But the reality soon became clear. More than 250,000 soldiers were trapped in a pocket roughly 50 miles wide. Their supply lines were gone. Their fuel was gone. The only connection to the outside world lay in the air, in the tenuous promise of an airlift that could never truly sustain them. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold his ground. There would be no breakout, no retreat. The Führer promised that supplies would arrive by air, that the Luftwaffe would deliver everything the Sixth Army needed, but even under perfect conditions, that would have been impossible. And in the frozen chaos of Stalingrad, there were no perfect conditions. The Luftwaffe managed only a fraction of what was required. Planes were few, the airfields far away, the weather unrelenting. Snowstorms blinded pilots. Ice formed on wings faster than it could be scraped off. Each flight that landed brought not relief, but a reminder of futility. A few tons of ammunition, some bread, a handful of medical supplies. Never enough. By December, food had become a memory. Rations were cut again and again until they ceased to mean anything. The average soldier received barely a few hundred calories a day. A slice of bread, a spoon of thin soup, a few grains of barley floating in water. Men grew skeletal, their cheeks hollow, their eyes distant. The cold slowed their movements until they seemed to drift through the ruins like ghosts. In some units, discipline began to fray. Soldiers searched alone, slipping away from their posts to look for anything edible. A bag of oats, a frozen potato. Others simply sat down in the snow and refused to move again. Paulus continued to send reports to Berlin, each one more desperate than the last. He wrote of hunger, of cold, of dwindling ammunition. The responses were polite but empty. Encouragement, praise, promises. No help was coming. On the other side of the lines, the Red Army endured its own misery, though of a different kind. They too fought in the cold and the dark, often without proper winter clothing. But unlike the trapped Germans, they were part of something larger, the tightening circle. From the north and south, Soviet artillery thundered day and night, softening the pocket. The city itself had become a maze of strongpoints. Soviet soldiers moved methodically, rooting out resistance, reclaiming one ruin at a time. To them, the sight of German prisoners was both astonishing and sobering. The once proud invaders now shuffled through the snow, wrapped in rags, their faces unshaven and grey. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Germans fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. For those inside the pocket, daily existence revolved around survival in its most basic form. Shelters were dug deep into cellars, lined with bricks and scraps of wood. The air was heavy with the smell of fuel and sweat. Fires burned low to conserve smoke. The floor was always damp, the walls always trembling from bombardment. Men slept in shifts, wrapped in whatever they could find. Blankets, curtains, torn uniforms. Doctors worked in darkness, performing what procedures they could with limited resources. The wounded were laid side by side in makeshift hospitals where there was little light and less hope. In the flicker of candlelight, shadows moved along the walls, the slow dance of men between life and death. Even in that frozen hell, some soldiers still wrote letters. They wrote not to be read, but to feel human again. They described the cold, the longing for home. They asked about families they would never see again. They folded the pages carefully and handed them to officers, knowing they would never leave the city. Such fragments are all that remain of men who once believed they were invincible. Despite hardship, the Sixth Army continued to fight. It was not hope that sustained them. Hope had long since vanished. It was habit, the muscle memory of soldiers who knew no other way to exist. They fired their rifles even when the bolts froze shut. They dug trenches in frozen earth. They patched uniforms with the fabric of enemy coats. For many, obedience had become the last form of dignity. Paulus issued orders. Officers relayed them. Men carried them out because that was all they had left. But even obedience began to falter as the truth became undeniable. In the quiet moments between bombardments, soldiers whispered to each other that they were already beyond rescue. A few hundred civilians were still alive within the ruins. Women, children, the elderly, living in holes and basements. They had survived bombardment, hunger, and months of crossfire. Their lives were measured by minutes, by the sound of shells and footsteps above. Soviet soldiers sometimes found them by accident. Entire families huddled together in cellars, eyes glazed, skin grey with cold. They spoke little, as though language itself had frozen. Some refused evacuation, even when offered. They said they would not leave the city again, not while strangers still fought over its bones. To live in such a place required a kind of endurance that had nothing to do with strength. It was the endurance of those who had nothing left to lose and still refused to vanish. In January, the snow deepened. The world shrank to shades of white and smoke. When the wind lifted, the air glittered faintly, as if the city were made of glass. But beauty here was only an illusion, a trick of the frozen sun. The Luftwaffe still attempted resupply missions, but the effort had become hopeless. Each flight risked disaster. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, and anti-aircraft fire filled the air like steel rain. Dozens of planes were shot down. Many never reached the pocket at all. The airfields, the Sixth Army's last lifelines, were bombed relentlessly. By mid-January, both were lost. With them went the final chance of escape. From then on, the Sixth Army was truly alone. The thermometer dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Weapons froze, blood froze, food froze. The living envied the stillness of those who had already passed. When Soviet loudspeakers called out over the ruins, offering surrender and food, most Germans did not respond. They had been told that surrender meant death, and yet each day small groups began to cross the lines, gaunt men with white flags made from bandages, trembling as they walked. Some were given soup and shelter. Others collapsed before they reached it. Those who remained clung to the belief that rescue would come, that Hitler would send another army, that the airlift would resume, that spring would change something. But the calendar meant nothing now. There was only cold and silence and the slow, unrelenting pressure of the encirclement. By late January 1943, the city was collapsing in on itself. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Communication with Berlin was fragmentary. Paulus sat in a basement headquarters beneath the ruins of a department store, surrounded by staff officers who no longer gave orders, but merely waited. The front was shrinking by the hour, and yet, even in this final stage, the will to resist flickered on. German soldiers still manned their posts, still loaded their weapons, still fired at shadows they could barely see. For them, Surrender was not an option, not from courage, but from disbelief. They had come so far, believed so much, that to admit defeat seemed impossible. In the final days of January, the bombardment reached its peak. The city shook continuously. Buildings that had survived months of shelling finally gave way, collapsing into clouds of dust. But beneath the roar, a strange silence began to grow, the silence that comes when there is no one left to fight. The German positions dwindled to small pockets, cellars, basements, a few streets. The Soviets advanced cautiously, aware that each ruin could still conceal a desperate enemy. And then at last, the firing began to fade. One by one, the guns fell quiet. The city that had been fire and thunder for half a year was suddenly still. In that stillness, the survivors looked at one another and understood. The end had come. Long before the final surrender, before the Sixth Army's radios went silent beneath the snow, the end had already begun. It started far beyond the city, in the open plains, under the same grey sky, where the cold wind carried only whispers of what was to come. For months, the Germans had been obsessed with Stalingrad itself, pouring men and machines into the ruins on the Volga. But while their eyes were fixed on the city, the Red Army's gaze had shifted outward, toward the flanks, because it was there, on those wide exposed plains, that the real opportunity lay. The Soviet plan would be called Operation Uranus, an encirclement so vast and sudden that it would change not just the battle, but the direction of the entire war. By the autumn of 1942, Soviet intelligence had recognized what the Germans refused to see. The lines protecting the Sixth Army's northern and southern flanks were dangerously weak. Instead of being held by German divisions, they were guarded mostly by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. Brave men, but poorly equipped, undertrained, and lacking proper anti-tank weapons. Behind them, the land stretched empty and open, flat steppe with little cover, perfect for armored movement. If these lines could be broken, the entire German position at Stalingrad could be cut off in days. Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky, architects of the plan, worked in secrecy. Their goal was not to retake the city directly, but to close a steel ring around it. The northern pincer would strike from the Don River, the southern from the steppe beyond. The two would meet somewhere west of Stalingrad, sealing the fate of every soldier trapped inside. It was an audacious idea, but the Red Army, hardened by years of suffering, was ready for audacity. Through October, Soviet forces gathered quietly in the fog and snow. Columns of tanks moved by night. Artillery was dragged into position under camouflage nets. Ammunition and fuel were stockpiled in hidden depots. To mask the build-up, fake radio transmissions were sent from other sectors, and reconnaissance aircraft flew misleading routes. Even Soviet soldiers on the front lines were not told what was coming, only that something vast was in motion. In Moscow, Stalin approved the operation with a single word: do it. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the world around Stalingrad changed forever. At dawn, a thick mist clung to the frozen plains. The temperature was below zero, and the air was still. The Romanian troops holding the northern line lit small fires for warmth, unaware of the force gathering in the haze ahead of them. Then, without warning, the horizon erupted. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire in unison. The bombardment rolled across the steppe like thunder, tearing through trenches and frozen earth. The shockwave shattered glass in villages miles away. The ground itself seemed to convulse. In minutes, communication lines were severed. Men stumbled from shelters, dazed, blinded by snow and smoke. And then, through the fog, came the tanks. Waves of Soviet armor advanced, their tracks grinding over ice. Behind them marched infantry in white camouflage, rifles slung low, faces hidden by frost. The Romanians fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. Their anti-tank guns froze. Their ammunition ran dry. Entire regiments disappeared in hours. By midday, the northern front had collapsed. 2 days later, on November 21st, the second hammer fell from the south. Soviet forces surged forward against the Romanian Fourth Army. supported by mechanized corps and tank divisions. Once again, the results were catastrophic for the defenders. Positions broke apart. Units vanished. The Soviet advance rolled forward almost unopposed, slicing through the thin line of resistance like a blade through paper. By nightfall, both pincers were moving steadily toward each other across the frozen plains. The Sixth Army inside Stalingrad remained unaware of just how dire the situation had become. Paulus received reports of enemy movements on the flanks, but assumed they were minor. Berlin dismissed the warnings as exaggerations. But to the men on the steppe, it was clear the storm was unstoppable. On November 23, 1942, near the town of Kalash-on-Don, the two Soviet fronts met. The northern and southern pincers linked hands, their tanks greeting each other amid snow and smoke. For the first time, the encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, more than 250,000 men, was trapped. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In less than 4 days, the tide had turned completely. Inside the pocket, confusion reigned. Paulus's headquarters learned of the encirclement hours after it had already happened. Communication with the outside world became sporadic. Columns of retreating units found themselves cut off and forced to turn back. The ring was tightening by the hour. When the news reached Hitler, he refused to believe it. He ordered Paulus to hold his position, to stand fast. Relief operations would come, he promised. The Luftwaffe would supply the army by air. There was no talk of retreat. In truth, the airlift was doomed from the start. To sustain the Sixth Army required at least 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe, operating from distant airfields, managed an average of barely 100. Pilots flew through blizzards, navigating by instinct. Many never returned. Those who did spoke of landing on runways slick with ice, surrounded by chaos. Thousands of desperate men reaching toward the cargo before it could even be unloaded. In some cases, planes took off again, carrying not supplies, but the wounded, skeletal men with frostbitten limbs, too weak to speak. The rest stayed behind. For the Red Army, the success of Operation Uranus was electric. After years of retreat and loss, they had not only stopped the enemy, they had trapped him. Celebrations spread quietly through the front, but there was little time to rest. The encirclement was vast, and the work of destroying it had only begun. Soviet commanders immediately began planning the next phase. Artillery was brought forward. Divisions were redeployed. The noose began to constrict. Yet even as victory seemed assured, the Soviet high command moved carefully. The Germans were still formidable, and winter itself remained an unpredictable ally. As December began, the reality of encirclement sank in. At first, many German soldiers refused to believe they were truly cut off. They expected a counteroffensive that would break the siege and restore the front. But days became weeks, and the promised relief never came. The Sixth Army's situation deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition ran low, fuel became precious. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel and turned into stationary bunkers. Even basic communication began to fail. Radios froze, batteries died. Orders arrived too late to matter. Soldiers still fought, but their movements had lost meaning. They were shadows fighting inside a shrinking cage. In mid-December, Field Marshal Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to break through from the southwest and reach the trapped army. For a brief moment, hope flickered. German troops advanced within 30 miles of the encirclement. Paulus's staff listened to the radio, counting the distance, waiting for the signal to break out. But the order never came. Hitler insisted that Paulus hold his ground until the relief reached him. Paulus, obedient to the end, obeyed. When Winter Storm collapsed under Soviet counterattacks, the last chance of escape vanished. By Christmas, it was clear the Sixth Army would not be rescued. The closing of the trap transformed Stalingrad from battle into catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of men were now prisoners of circumstance, not yet captured, but no longer free. The cold grew worse, the rations grew smaller, the sick and wounded filled every shelter. Letters and diaries from the period read like whispers from another world. And still, the orders came from Berlin. Hold the city. For the officers, the burden was unbearable. They were trapped between loyalty to command and responsibility to their men. Paulus himself, a man of precision and discipline, aged years in weeks. He stopped shaving. His voice grew hoarse. His headquarters, once orderly, descended into dim silence punctuated by the sound of distant shell fire. Many soldiers still believed in rescue, but others began to surrender quietly to despair. They no longer asked when the relief would come, only if they would still be alive to see it. The sound of shovels in frozen ground was constant. Every day, more graves were dug, shallow, temporary, soon to be lost under snow. The German army that had marched across Europe with precision and pride was now dissolving into silence. Outside the pocket, the Red Army prepared for the final blow. The encirclement had worked perfectly, but the enemy within was still dangerous. So, rather than rush, the Soviets tightened their grip slowly, methodically. Artillery pounded the German positions day and night. Infantry crept forward under the cover of darkness, occupying one ruin after another. Tanks moved cautiously through the snow, their engines muffled. Every day the circle grew smaller. By January, it was no longer a ring, but a fist. Operation Uranus had begun as a military plan, but by the time it ended, it had become something more, a symbol of reversal. It marked the moment the tide of war turned, when the invincible lost their certainty and the defeated found their strength. Stalingrad had once been a name whispered in fear. Now it became a word of hope, a promise that even in ruin, resistance could prevail. For the men still trapped in the city, this realization came too late. But for those beyond it, across the frozen steppe and the long arc of the front, it changed everything. The trap had closed. The dream of conquest had become a prison. And the war, which had once seemed endless in one direction, began, imperceptibly, inevitably, to turn. When the jaws of the Soviet trap closed around Stalingrad in late November 1942, a kind of stillness fell over the snow-covered steppe, the heavy, waiting stillness that follows catastrophe. Inside that vast white ring, the German Sixth Army was no longer an army in the ordinary sense. It was a population, more than 250,000 men, pressed into a pocket of frozen rubble, surrounded on all sides by silence and fire. The encirclement had turned the hunter into the hunted, and in that transformation lay the beginning of one of the most haunting collapses in modern history. The cauldron, as the Germans came to call it, der Kessel, stretched roughly 50 miles across, narrowing each week as Soviet pressure increased. It was not a single fortress, but a patchwork of strong points, fragments of regiments, remnants of divisions. Between these fragments lay open ground, white fields where the wind howled endlessly and the snow was stained with ash. There were no clear front lines anymore. The Sixth Army's outer defences were thin and brittle, manned by men who were already weakening, their rifles half frozen. Behind them, scattered command posts operated out of cellars and warehouses, their radios fading in and out through static. The only constant was cold, a cold so absolute it became part of the landscape, part of the men themselves. It cracked their skin, numbed their hands, froze the ink in their pens. They burned maps, crates, even pieces of furniture for warmth. The air above the pocket was alive with aircraft. Soviet bombers by day, the last desperate German transports by night. But each day, fewer planes came. The airlift, Hitler's promised salvation, was collapsing under its own impossibility. By December, the Sixth Army received less than 1/10 of what it needed to survive. General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, lived like a ghost within his own headquarters. He was a man of precision, a meticulous planner, but now all the plans in the world could not help him. His headquarters, once a grand administrative building, was buried beneath rubble, its windows shattered, its corridors lined with wounded men. He still held briefings, still signed orders, but his words carried the hollow sound of ritual. There was nothing left to command. Every day, reports came in. No fuel, no food, no ammunition. Every night, the same reply went out to Berlin. We hold our positions. He had been ordered to fight to the last. He obeyed, not out of fanaticism, but because obedience was the only structure left in a world that had lost all meaning. Behind him, his officers debated in whispers. Some urged a breakout while there was still time. Others believed such an attempt would be futile. Paulus, cautious by nature, chose inaction, a decision that would seal the fate of tens of thousands. The promise of supply by air had been the great illusion. The Luftwaffe had done it once before, in another pocket earlier that year, and Hitler believed it could be done again. But Stalingrad was different. The scale was too vast, the weather too cruel, the enemy too prepared. Each transport plane that approached the pocket faced walls of anti-aircraft fire. Pilots flew through blizzards, guided only by the faint glow of burning oil drums that marked the runways. Many planes crashed before landing. Others unloaded supplies onto frozen ground, only for them to be buried by shell fire moments later. Even when the flight succeeded, the math did not. An army of 250,000 needed hundreds of tons of food and fuel each day. The airlift delivered barely a fraction of that, sometimes only enough to feed a single division. Desperate improvisations followed. Supply crates were packed with anything available, bullets mixed with bandages, food mixed with fuel. Some fell into Soviet hands, others shattered on impact. By January 1943, the pocket had become a world of its own, a frozen society collapsing inward. There were front lines, hospitals, command centers, graveyards, all within a few square miles. Men shuffled through the snow like ghosts, wrapped in rags and blankets. Discipline broke down in places. Soldiers traded watches, medals, and pistols for scraps of bread. Some dug into the earth to find frozen potatoes from abandoned fields. The cold turned fingers black. The hospitals, if they could still be called that, were dark caverns filled with the smell of smoke and kerosene. Doctors worked by candlelight, surrounded by men whispering prayers in dozens of languages. Pain was constant, sleep a luxury, hope a stranger. Outside, the artillery never stopped. Each explosion sent showers of snow through the broken ceilings, settling gently on the living and the still alike. The final link to the outside world was the airfields at Potomnik and Gumrak. For weeks, they had been the lifelines of the pocket, the only means by which the wounded could be evacuated and supplies could trickle in. But the Soviets knew this as well. They targeted the airfields relentlessly, bombarding them until the runways were cratered and the wrecks of transport planes lay twisted in the snow. Potomnik fell first, in mid-January. Gumrak lasted a few days longer. When it too was overrun, the airlift ended for good. The last planes lifted off into the grey sky, engines straining, carrying a handful of officers and the last of the wounded. Those left behind watched them vanish into the clouds, knowing they would never return. From that day on, the Sixth Army was completely alone. Around the pocket, the Red Army continued to advance with deliberate patience. Artillery softened German positions day and night. Each village, each factory ruin, each mound of frozen earth became an objective to be taken and cleared. The Soviets moved cautiously, conserving their strength. They knew the enemy was broken, but they also knew desperation could still be dangerous. In some sectors, entire German units surrendered without resistance. In others, small groups fought to the last, defending positions that no longer mattered, firing at shadows until their ammunition ran out. The front contracted daily. By the third week of January, the pocket had shrunk to less than a third of its original size. From the air, Soviet observers described it as a single, burning scar. Smoke, ice, and loss stretching along the river. For those still inside, reality itself began to blur. The constant hunger, the sleepless nights, the shock of cold, all combined to erode thought. Men spoke to ghosts, or to themselves. Some forgot their own names. Paulus's headquarters was now buried beneath the ruins of a department store in the city center. There was no heat, no light, no running water. His officers wrapped themselves in blankets and scribbled reports on scraps of paper. The telephones no longer worked. The radio crackled intermittently, carrying only fragments of sentences. Berlin continued to send messages. Hold fast. Reinforcements are on the way. No one believed them anymore. In the cellars, men prayed not for victory, but for an end. Any end. By January 25th, the pocket had split in two. To the south, remnants of the German IV Corps fought among the factories and warehouses near the Volga. To the north, Paulus and what remained of his staff were cut off, isolated, surrounded by Soviet troops on all sides. The Soviets offered surrender terms: humane treatment, food, medical care. At first, Paulus refused. Hitler had ordered him to fight to the last bullet, to die rather than surrender. But the army was already dying, not from bullets, but from hunger, frost, and exhaustion. When Soviet forces finally stormed the southern pocket on January 31st, Paulus's headquarters was one of the last positions left. That morning, a delegation of Soviet officers arrived to demand surrender. Paulus, pale and silent, agreed. At 7:35 a.m., he became the first German field marshal ever to be captured, alive. Hitler had expected him to take his own life. Instead, Paulus simply said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for that Austrian corporal." Even after Paulus surrendered, fighting continued for several more days. Small groups of Germans still held out in the ruins, unaware that their commander had capitulated. Some refused to believe it. Others were too far gone to care. On February 2, 1943, the last pockets of resistance fell silent. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the roughly 250,000 Axis soldiers trapped inside the pocket, only about 90,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest remained where they fell, buried under the snow, beneath the city that had consumed them. When the Soviets finally surveyed the ruins, they found a landscape beyond imagination. The city was gone, flattened, burned, frozen. In some places, debris formed walls. In others, it was scattered like dust. The living were scarcely different. Hollow-eyed, skeletal, wrapped in rags. Some still carried weapons they no longer had the strength to use. Others simply stared into the distance, their minds elsewhere. The Soviet soldiers who liberated the ruins were hardened men, accustomed to hardship, but even they were shaken. They walked through the silence, past wrecked tanks and frozen ground, and realized that this wasteland, was what victory looked like. For Germany, the loss of the Sixth Army was a catastrophe beyond numbers. It shattered the myth of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe. It broke the illusion that Hitler's will could overcome all obstacles. In one stroke, an entire army had vanished, not destroyed in battle, but consumed by hubris, weather, and time. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was both triumph and trauma, proof that endurance could defeat aggression, that a people could survive even when civilization itself seemed to collapse. But for those who had lived through it, there was no triumph, only exhaustion, silence, and the faint understanding that nothing in their lives would ever return to what it had been. When the last echoes of gunfire faded and the wind swept clean the snow-covered ruins, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a symbol of destruction, of endurance, and of the terrible cost of certainty. The Sixth Army had reached the Volga, and there it remained, forever. When the guns finally fell silent, the city seemed to exhale. A long, cold breath that drifted over the ruins, through the hollow shells of factories, across the still water of the Volga. It was February 1943. For the first time in months, no shells fell, no engines roared, no planes crossed the sky. Only the wind remained, carrying with it the dust of a city that had ceased to exist. The battle was over. But what remained was not peace, only the aftermath. From above, Stalingrad looked like the surface of another world. A grey wasteland stretched along the riverbank, scarred by craters and blackened ruins. Nothing was untouched. Factories were torn open, their steel frameworks twisted. Whole neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by fields of rubble. Even the earth itself had changed, churned, burned, and broken by months of bombardment. The air still smelled of oil, smoke, and memory. Even the snow was grey, soaked with ash. In the silence, the only movement came from the crows, circling above the wreckage, their black wings cutting through the pale light. Soviet soldiers moved through the ruins in small patrols, rifles slung low, faces hidden by scarves. They spoke little. They had been fighting for so long that even victory felt foreign, an echo they could not quite believe. One soldier later wrote, "When it ended, we did not cheer. We looked around and wondered how anything could ever live here again." In the days after the surrender, rescue teams combed through the ruins. They moved carefully, calling out names, listening for faint sounds beneath the rubble. Sometimes they found survivors, a soldier trapped in a basement, a child hidden in a cellar, a nurse buried in a collapsed trench. More often, they found only silence. The city was full of hidden graves. Men had passed in stairwells, in tunnels, in foxholes, in the wrecks of tanks. There were too many to count. The living buried them where they lay, marking graves with bits of wood or twisted metal. Some were nameless, others carried identification tags, but many were never found at all, lost to the dust, to the river, to time. For those who lived, survival was not the same as escape. The Soviet soldiers who walked out of Stalingrad were hollow-eyed and silent. They had seen things that words could not describe. Some had fought in the same few streets for months, their world reduced to a few hundred meters of ruin. Many were deaf from shelling, their hands raw from the cold. They were greeted as heroes, but they did not feel like heroes. They had lost friends, families, parts of themselves. They carried the city inside them like a scar. The German prisoners, meanwhile, began their long march east. Thin, weakened, wrapped in rags, they trudged through the snow toward the railheads that would take them to labor camps across the Soviet Union. Many collapsed along the way, their bodies swallowed by the same frozen steppe they had crossed with such confidence a year before. For most, the journey never ended. They simply disappeared, nameless, forgotten, consumed by distance. And yet, somehow, life began again. In the spring, the snow melted, revealing a city unrecognizable but still breathing. The Volga thawed and began to flow freely once more, carrying away the ashes of war. Civilians returned, women, children, the elderly, walking back along the shattered roads, searching for homes that no longer existed. They found only foundations, chimneys, and the faint outlines of streets buried beneath debris. Still, they began to rebuild. They patched roofs, cleared rubble, planted vegetables in craters. The first trains returned by summer. New factories were planned even as old ones smoldered. And amid the wreckage, a strange determination took root. The city that had been destroyed would rise again. Stalingrad would become a living monument to endurance. Every building rebuilt, every bridge repaired, every street renamed was a quiet act of defiance, a promise that this place and the people who had survived it would not vanish. In the years that followed, Stalingrad became legend. Songs were written, films were made, medals were awarded. The Soviet Union celebrated the victory as proof of destiny, the triumph of socialism, of the people, of the will of the state. And yet, beneath the slogans and ceremonies, the real story endured in whispers. The hunger, the cold, the quiet courage of those who refused to yield. For the survivors, memory was both honor and burden. They could never forget the smell of smoke, the faces they had known, the endless sound of artillery echoing through the ruins. Many spoke little of it for the rest of their lives. They had not fought for glory, or ideology, or even survival. They had simply fought because there was no other choice. In Germany, Stalingrad became something different, a wound that never fully healed. It was the moment when faith in Hitler began to crack, when the myth of invincibility turned to dust. Mothers and wives received letters marked missing, and then, later, presumed lost. Families gathered around radios in silence, hearing the news that an entire army had vanished. For those who returned years later from Soviet captivity, a few thousand men from the hundreds of thousands who had gone, life was a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. They were celebrated as survivors, yet treated as reminders of a defeat no one wished to remember. They carried with them the same silence as their Soviet counterparts, the same ghosts. The ruins of Stalingrad were left standing for years as a warning and a memorial. Children played among rusted tanks. Grass grew over shell craters. The city became both grave and classroom, a place where the cost of war was written plainly in stone and steel. When it was finally rebuilt, it was given a new name, Volgograd. The factories reopened, streets were renamed, life continued. But beneath the new foundations lay the bones of the old city, and beneath those, the bones of hundreds of thousands of men. Their presence could not be erased. It was as if the earth itself remembered. Today, the wind still moves across the river in the same way it did in that winter of 1942. The Volga still carries the same slow rhythm, and though the city is alive again, cars, lights, voices, there are places where the silence lingers. If you stand at the edge of the river at dawn, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of artillery, the whisper of footsteps. In snow, the hum of engines that will never start again. The ghosts of Stalingrad do not haunt with malice. They are not angry. They simply remain, reminders of what endurance costs and what survival demands. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a turning point in a war. It was the moment when the world learned that even in ruin, even in the coldest dark, human beings could refuse to surrender. The city on the Volga had been burned, shattered, tested beyond measure, but it did not die. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Stalingrad, that even when everything else is lost, hope, strength, reason, something within the human spirit endures. Something that says, not yet. There are moments in history when a place becomes more than geography, when its name becomes an idea, a symbol, a whisper that travels far beyond its borders. Stalingrad was such a place. What began as a city on the banks of the Volga became something greater, a lesson in endurance written in fire and snow. The ruins, the hunger, the silence, all of it combined into a story that still echoes, not just in history books, but in the quiet spaces of the human heart. Because Stalingrad was not simply destroyed, it was transformed, from a city into a testament, from a tragedy into a warning. After the battle, the Soviet Union faced a choice, whether to leave the ruins as they were, a graveyard of pride and pain, or to rebuild. They chose both. The reconstruction of Stalingrad began almost as soon as the smoke cleared. Tens of thousands of workers, soldiers, and volunteers came from across the Soviet Union. They arrived with shovels, bricks, and the quiet determination of people who had already lost everything once. It was a different kind of battle, one against despair, against memory. They cleared the rubble by hand, rebuilt factories, repaired bridges, and replanted trees in soil still mixed with ash. Slowly, the skyline returned. New buildings rose where old ones had fallen. Streets were redrawn. The hum of industry returned to the riverbank, but the scars remained. Even as the city revived, reminders of the battle lingered. Bullet holes in walls, fragments of metal half buried in courtyards, the faint smell of oil when the wind blew from the east. To walk through Stalingrad was to walk through layers of time. through the present built upon the past, the living built upon memory. In 1945, as the war ended, Stalingrad was awarded the title of Hero City of the Soviet Union, one of the highest honors the state could bestow. It was not just recognition of victory, but of suffering, the kind of suffering that defines generations. For the Soviet people, the name Stalingrad came to mean something sacred. It was invoked in speeches, carved into monuments, sung in songs. Every citizen knew the story, how the city had refused to die, how its defenders had held the line against the darkest winter of the century. In the decades that followed, the city became a place of pilgrimage. Visitors came from across the world to stand on its ground. Veterans, students, survivors. They came to see the great memorials, the eternal flame, the colossal statue known as the Motherland Calls. A figure of stone towering over the city, sword raised high, her face fierce and mournful. She stands on Mamayev Kurgan, a hill once soaked in blood, now a place of silence. From her summit, the Volga stretches to the horizon, wide, ancient, unchanging. It was there that so much was lost, and there that something unbreakable was born. To the world, Stalingrad became a symbol of endurance, of defiance, of the moment when tyranny met its limit. But its meaning was more complex than any monument could express. It was also a warning, a reminder of what happens when human ambition outruns compassion, when ideology consumes empathy, when war becomes not a failure of peace, but a pursuit of glory. The ruins of Stalingrad spoke not just of courage, but of consequence. They told of a city that became a graveyard because men believed conquest could remake the world. And they told, too, of a people who discovered that survival itself could be a form of victory. The city had been crushed, yet it endured. Its people had been broken, yet they rebuilt. In that paradox lay the truth of Stalingrad, that the measure of humanity is not in what it destroys, but in what it rebuilds. 80 years have passed. The city is now called Volgograd. Children play in parks where tanks once burned. Trams run along the riverbank where the air once shimmered with fire. Shoppers pass storefronts that stand above old foundations, unaware that beneath their feet lie the remnants of cellars and trenches. The past is never truly buried here. It lingers quietly in the names of streets, in the lines of stone monuments, in the rhythm of the river that has seen it all before. Every year, on the anniversary of victory, the city pauses. Sirens sound across the Volga, and for 1 minute, everything stops. Cars halt, voices fade. The wind moves through the city like a breath, and in that silence, the ghosts return, not in fear, but in remembrance. The Battle of Stalingrad was many things: a turning point, a tragedy, a triumph, a warning. But above all, it was proof. Proof of what the human spirit can endure when everything else is gone. It showed that even in the darkest cold, even when surrounded and starving, people could still choose to stand. That faith, even if born of desperation, can outlast despair. The city on the Volga was meant to be erased, a name struck from maps, a symbol shattered. Instead, it became eternal. And so, the story of Stalingrad is not really a story of war at all. It is a story of survival, of men and women who faced the impossible and refused to yield, of a place that was burned, broken, and buried, and yet somehow still breathes. If you walk the riverbanks at dusk, when the light turns gold and the water moves slow and heavy, you can feel it. The quiet pulse of something ancient, something human, the heartbeat of a city that would not die. The Volga flows as it always has, wide and patient, carrying fragments of ice in winter, reflecting the sun in summer. It does not remember the way we remember. It does not mourn or celebrate. It simply flows, past the monuments, past the parks, past the new buildings that stand where ruins once lay. And perhaps that is the truest memorial of all, not the statues or the speeches, but the river itself, constant, indifferent, eternal. A reminder that life continues, that time moves forward, even when we wish it would pause, that the world is larger than any single moment, no matter how terrible or profound. The people of Stalingrad, those who fought, those who died, those who survived, are mostly gone now. Their voices have faded into history, their stories preserved in archives and memories passed down through generations. But something of them remains. In the soil of the riverbank, in the stones of the rebuilt city, in the silence that falls each year when the sirens sound, they remain not as ghosts, but as echoes, faint impressions left by those who lived through something beyond comprehension and somehow emerged on the other side. They did not ask for glory. They did not seek to be remembered. They simply endured because there was no other choice. And in that endurance lies a truth that transcends the specifics of battle, the details of strategy, the names and dates that fill the history books. It is the truth that human beings, when pushed to the absolute limit, possess within themselves a capacity for survival that defies logic. Not through strength, but through stubbornness. Not through courage, but through the refusal to disappear. Not through hope, but through the simple, persistent act of taking one more breath. The city sleeps now, as cities do. Lights flicker on in windows. Families gather for evening meals. Children do homework at kitchen tables. Lovers walk hand in hand along the embankment, watching the sun set over the river. Life, in all its ordinary beauty, has returned. And yet, beneath the surface of the ordinary, the extraordinary lingers. In the stories, grandparents tell their grandchildren. In the way the old veterans, fewer each year, still stand a little straighter when they pass the memorials. In the texture of the city itself, the way certain corners feel heavier than others, as if the air there remembers what happened. Stalingrad is gone. Volgograd stands in its place, but the name still echoes. It appears in books, in films, in the quiet conversations of those who study history and those who lived it. It has become a word that means more than a city, more than a battle. It has become a symbol of what happens when the world catches fire, and what remains when the flames finally die. For those seeking sleep, let the river be your guide. Imagine yourself standing on its banks in the quiet of evening. The water is calm, reflecting the last light of day. The wind is gentle, carrying with it the scent of earth and distance. Behind you, the city hums with life. But here, at the water's edge, there is only peace. The struggles of the past have settled into the soil. The pain has been absorbed by time. What remains is simply the river and the sky and the slow turning of the earth. Let your breathing match the rhythm of the water, slow, steady, eternal. Let your thoughts drift like the current, moving without effort, flowing without resistance. There is nothing to hold on to here, nothing to solve or understand or fix. Only the gentle recognition that you are part of something larger, a long chain of human experience that stretches back through time and forward into the future. You are safe here, on these banks. The battles are over. The cold has passed. What was broken has been rebuilt, or has returned to the earth to nourish what comes next. The story of Stalingrad ends not with triumph or defeat, but with continuation, with the river that keeps flowing, with the city that keeps living, with the people who keep remembering. And then, when memory becomes too heavy, gently setting it down and walking forward into tomorrow. This is the way of all things. Darkness gives way to light. Winter yields to spring. Silence, eventually, becomes sound again. And in that eternal rhythm, the turning of seasons, the flow of water, the rise and fall of breath, we find our peace. Not in the absence of struggle, but in the knowledge that struggle too passes. That even the longest night eventually ends. That the river, patient and wise, will carry us forward if we let it. Rest now. Let the weight of history settle somewhere else for a time. Let the cold of winter become a distant memory. Let the river carry you gently. The city on the Volga has done its work. It has shown us what endurance means. It has taught us that even in the darkest moments, something within us refuses to surrender. But now the lesson is learned, the story is told, and all that remains is the gentle movement of water, the soft embrace of night, and the promise that morning will come again. Sleep well. The river watches over you. The ghosts have found their peace. And the city breathes on beneath the stars, beside the water, eternal and unbroken.